It was just another ordinary day for Ben Harris. The sun had barely risen, casting a soft light across the sleepy town. Ben was already awake, like he always was, ready to begin his work. He wasn't much to look at, just a simple man with a quiet face and an old truck. His clothes were nothing special, faded jeans, a worn-out jacket, and boots that had seen better days. Nothing about him stood out, and that's the way he liked it. People didn't notice him. They didn't know his story, and he liked it that way. Ben's truck was just as ordinary as him, a beat-up old thing with rust spots on the door and a cracked windshield. It had seen better days, but it worked, and that's all Ben cared about. He'd spent years driving the same old route, delivering supplies to places most people never thought about. Day after day, the same roads, the same buildings, the same faces. But for all the simplicity of his life, there was something that most people didn't see. Something hidden beneath the surface. Ben was not just a truck driver. He wasn't the kind of man who wore his past on his sleeve, but deep inside, there was a story that could shake up everything around him. It was a story of a time long ago, a time when Ben was someone else entirely. He had been part of something bigger. He wasn't always just the quiet man with the truck. There was a time when he had been a soldier, trained in ways most people couldn't imagine. A time when his life had been filled with action, danger, and decisions that could change the world. Ben had left that world behind, or so he thought. The military, with its strict rules and endless discipline, wasn't a life he wanted anymore. He'd hung up his uniform years ago and tried to live a quiet life. But the skills, the training, the mindset, they never left him. They were still there, buried deep inside him, ready for the moment they would be needed again. The town didn't know that. They saw him as just another truck driver, a man who worked long hours and didn't make a fuss. They had no idea who Ben really was or what he was capable of. He didn't need to remind people of his past. He didn't need to show off. Ben had learned long ago that being quiet was often the best way to stay unnoticed. But sometimes, being unnoticed meant that people took you for granted. They thought you were weak, or maybe even harmless. And that's exactly what the bikers thought when they saw Ben's old truck parked on the side of the road one evening. The bikers had been causing trouble in town for months. They were loud, rude, and always looking for someone to push around. They had their eyes set on Ben from the moment they saw him. After all, he was just a truck driver. What could he possibly do to stop them? That night, they made their move. Ben had parked his truck along the road for a break, the cool night air helping him relax after a long day of driving. The road was quiet, with only the sound of his truck's engine ticking in the background as it cooled. Ben leaned against the side of his truck, looking at the stars. It was peaceful. But the peace didn't last. A loud roar of motorcycle engines broke the stillness of the night. Ben didn't have to look to know who it was. He had seen them around before, the bikers who thought they owned the town. They weren't just any bikers. They were troublemakers, and they liked to cause problems. They liked to push people around, and they had made Ben their next target. Ben didn't flinch. He didn't move. He kept his eyes on the stars, his posture calm and relaxed. He knew what was coming, but he wasn't afraid. The bikers slowed down as they approached. They could see him standing there, and to them, he was an easy target. He wasn't even looking at them. He was just an old truck driver, out here on the side of the road in the middle of nowhere. The bikers circled him, revving their engines and laughing loudly. They liked to play games like this, intimidating people who were alone. It made them feel powerful. Ben didn't respond. He simply stood there, not acknowledging them. He was used to being ignored and underestimated. It wasn't the first time someone had tried to push him around, and it wouldn't be the last. He didn't care about their taunts. He didn't care about their loud, arrogant behavior. But then they made a mistake. One of the bikers, a tall man with a leather jacket and a rough face, shouted at Ben. "What's the matter, old man? You scared of us?" His voice was mocking, filled with contempt. Ben didn't answer. He didn't need to. The biker seemed to take that as a challenge. He revved his engine again, driving in a tight circle around Ben's truck. Then, without warning, he tossed a rock at the windshield. It hit with a loud crack, shattering the glass. The sound of the glass breaking was sharp, like a loud slap in the face. The other bikers laughed. They thought it was funny. Ben's hand tightened into a fist, but he didn't move. He simply watched the bikers, his eyes cold and unblinking. They didn't realize what they had just done. It wasn't just the truck they were messing with. They had no idea who Ben was or what he was capable of. But soon, they would. The bikers took it further. One of them grabbed a spray can and began to spray paint graffiti across the side of Ben's truck. Another threw a handful of dirt onto the hood. The air was thick with the sound of their laughter, as if they had already won. But Ben was patient. He didn't need to fight back right away. He knew that sometimes, the best thing to do was wait. He knew that sometimes, letting people think they had won was the best way to surprise them. Ben had been trained for moments like this. He had learned in the army that people who were too confident were often the easiest to defeat. The bikers didn't know it, but they had just stepped into a trap. They were going to regret it, and Ben would be the one to show them why. As the bikers continued to destroy his truck, Ben took a deep breath, keeping his calm. The skills he had learned so many years ago, the ones he thought he'd left behind, were coming back. His mind was sharp, his body was ready, and he knew exactly what to do. But for now, he let them laugh. He let them think they were in control. The bikers never cared for Ben. They didn't care to know anything about him, but that didn't stop them from making him their target. They didn't see him as a man. To them, he was just another faceless person, a lonely truck driver who didn't matter. They thought he was weak, just another easy target. For weeks now, the bikers had been harassing Ben. It started small at first, with them driving past his truck and laughing, making rude gestures. They'd yell insults at him, things like, "Get off the road, old man," or "You're too slow, grandpa." Sometimes, they would speed past him just to make sure he saw their bikes roaring by, loud and fast. At first, Ben didn't react. He didn't care. He had been ignored his whole life, treated as if he didn't belong. It didn't bother him. But with every passing day, the bikers became bolder. The insults turned into taunts, and the taunts turned into threats. They started following him, tailing his truck for miles, revving their engines behind him like a constant, annoying roar. Ben knew it was just a matter of time before they would do something more, but he kept his calm. He had learned to keep his emotions in check, to wait for the right moment. But tonight was different. It was just another quiet evening when Ben pulled over on the side of the road. He had been driving for hours, and he needed a short break. His eyes were heavy, but he couldn't risk falling asleep at the wheel. So, he parked his truck, stepped out into the cool air, and stretched his legs. The night was calm, with only the distant sound of wind rustling through the trees. The sky was clear, with a few stars twinkling above. Ben stood there for a while, lost in the peaceful silence. But that silence didn't last long. As he was leaning against his truck, he heard the familiar sound of motorcycle engines approaching. The bikers. This time, there were more of them, at least 5, maybe more. Ben didn't need to look to know they were coming for him. He had been expecting it. They had been following him for a while now, getting closer and closer to the moment when they would finally make their move. The bikers didn't slow down as they got near. Instead, they revved their engines loudly, speeding past Ben's truck just close enough for him to feel the wind from their bikes. But they didn't stop there. No, they came around again. This time, they circled him. Around and around they went, their engines roaring as they came closer and closer. Ben could hear their laughter over the sound of the bikes, mocking and cruel. They were in control. Or so they thought. One of the bikers, a big man with a thick beard and a leather vest, looked down at Ben from his motorcycle and laughed. "Look at this old guy," he said, his voice full of mockery. "You think you're some kind of hero? Ha! Look at you, just standing there like you don't even care." Ben stood still, not saying a word. He wasn't afraid. But inside, his anger was building. He didn't need to show it. He didn't need to shout back. But the longer they circled, the more it felt like a pressure was building inside him. Another biker, this one smaller but with a loud voice, yelled out, "What's the matter, old man? Too scared to fight? You gonna just let us mess with you?" Ben's fists tightened at his sides. The anger inside him grew, but he still didn't react. He was a man who had learned the art of patience. He wasn't going to let them get under his skin. Not yet. But then, without warning, one of them reached into a bag strapped to his bike and pulled out a handful of rocks. With a sneer, he hurled one at Ben's truck. The rock hit with a sharp crack against the side of the truck, leaving a large dent in the metal. Ben's eyes flashed, but he didn't move. He didn't react. Not yet. The bikers laughed, enjoying the sight of the damage they had caused. "You really gonna let us do this, old man?" the same biker taunted. Another rock came flying through the air, hitting the truck's door with another loud bang. Ben's hand clenched tightly around the side mirror. The rage inside him burned brighter now. They were messing with his truck, but more than that, they were messing with his patience. The smaller biker, the one who had been shouting earlier, pulled out another rock, this time larger than the first. He tossed it high in the air and aimed it at the truck's windshield. The rock hit with a loud crash, and the glass shattered instantly. The sharp sound of breaking glass filled the air, and for a moment, everything was silent. Ben's heart raced, and his fists clenched tighter. But he stayed still. He didn't move. The bikers didn't stop. They were enjoying themselves, thinking they had won. One by one, they tossed more rocks, more debris at the truck. With each hit, the damage grew worse. The side panels were dented, the paint was scratched, and the windshield was completely shattered. It was as if they had decided to break him down, piece by piece. Ben could feel his blood boiling, but he still didn't react. The tension in the air was thick now, the bikers closing in around him like vultures circling a wounded animal. They had made a mistake. They didn't know who they were dealing with. They thought he was just some old man with an old truck. But they were about to find out just how wrong they were. Ben took a deep breath, trying to calm himself. His mind was focused now. He didn't need to react in anger. He had other ways of handling this. But still, the bikers kept taunting him. The big man with the thick beard leaned down and shouted, "I told you, old man, this is our town now. You're nothing. Just a weak, old fool." Ben's jaw tightened, but he didn't speak. He didn't need to. He had nothing to prove. One of the bikers, the smallest of them all, got off his bike and walked closer to Ben. He had a smirk on his face, as if he thought Ben was too scared to do anything. He leaned in, getting close to Ben's face. "What are you gonna do now, huh? Nothing but an old man, and your truck's ruined. What do you have left?" The bikers circled around Ben's truck, their laughter growing louder, the sound of their engines filling the air. They seemed to think they had won. Each one of them wore a grin, confident in their belief that Ben would do nothing. He had not raised a hand to stop them, not even when they threw rocks at his truck. He just stood there, calm, silent, taking the abuse. It was a scene that might have broken many men, But Ben wasn't like the others. He had endured worse before, far worse. "Hey, old man," the big biker shouted again, "we're gonna finish what we started. Don't you think it's time for you to leave this town? It's not your place anymore." Ben's eyes were cold now. He wasn't looking at them, but he was aware of everything around him. The bikers thought they could control the situation, but in reality, they were playing right into his hands. They didn't know it yet, but they had made a mistake they would regret. Ben wasn't afraid. And it wasn't because he was some invincible hero. It wasn't because he had something to prove. It was because Ben knew how to wait, how to stay calm when the world around him was falling apart. His training had taught him that the best time to act was when your enemies least expected it. And the bikers? They were so sure of themselves, so confident in their ability to intimidate him, that they couldn't even see what was coming. The small biker, who had been walking closer to Ben, stood just a few feet away now. He still wore that smug look on his face, the one that seemed to say, "You're nothing, old man." His eyes were full of mischief as he waited for Ben to speak, to react in some way. But Ben didn't. He just stood still, his gaze steady, his posture relaxed. "What's wrong?" the small biker said with a laugh. "You scared? You gonna cry? Come on, do something. Show us what you've got." The tension in the air was thick now. Ben could feel it, could almost taste it. The bikers were getting more aggressive, and their taunts were growing bolder. The pressure was building, but still, Ben didn't move. He wasn't going to fall for their tricks. He knew they were trying to provoke him, trying to get him to make a mistake. But Ben was patient. He had learned long ago that when you wait for the right moment, you can strike with more power than if you just react impulsively. Then, out of nowhere, the big biker with the thick beard revved his engine loudly, almost as if to remind everyone of his dominance. The sound was deafening, filling the space around Ben with a roar. The small biker looked at him and laughed, giving him a thumbs up. They all thought they were in control. They thought they were the ones who held the power. But Ben knew better. He could feel the anger rising in him, but he didn't let it show. He couldn't let them see that. The bikers had made a critical mistake, and they were about to learn just how badly they had misjudged him. They had underestimated him, and that would be their downfall. Ben's hand moved, just slightly, and the small biker didn't notice. No one noticed. Ben had learned the art of subtlety in his past, learned how to hide his actions until the moment was right. He took a slow step backward, just enough to give him space. The bikers were too focused on taunting him to pay attention to the subtle movements he made. "What's wrong?" the small biker asked, his voice full of false concern. "You gonna just stand there all night? What are you waiting for?" Ben didn't respond. He wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of knowing his thoughts. Instead, he just stood there, watching them. His eyes were focused, but his body was still. The only sound now was the constant roar of their engines and the soft wind that blew across the road. Ben wasn't paying attention to the noise. He wasn't thinking about the bikers. His mind was sharp, his body ready for what was about to happen. The moment came quickly. The small biker, who had been taunting him the most, reached out and grabbed a rock from the ground. With a sneer, he tossed it at Ben's truck. The rock flew through the air, and as it neared the truck, Ben moved. It was fast. It was so fast that the biker didn't even see it coming. In one smooth motion, Ben stepped forward, his hand reaching out to catch the rock in midair. The small biker froze, his eyes wide with surprise. The others looked on, unsure of what had just happened. Ben didn't even blink. He held the rock in his hand for a moment, staring at it as if it were nothing more than a simple object. And then, without warning, he threw it back. Not at the biker. Not at the truck. He threw it in a perfect arc, sending it flying toward the big biker, the one with the thick beard who had been revving his engine. The rock hit the side of his motorcycle with a loud crack, knocking it off balance. The bikers gasped in shock as the big biker struggled to keep his bike upright. For a moment, he seemed to lose control, swerving dangerously on his motorcycle. The others took a step back, their eyes wide with disbelief. Ben's calmness, his quick reflexes, had taken them all by surprise. They weren't used to this. They were used to intimidating people, used to making them back down with their loud voices and threats. But Ben wasn't like the others. He didn't flinch. He didn't shout. He didn't make threats. He just acted, swiftly and decisively, and now, the bikers were beginning to realize that maybe they had pushed him too far. The big biker managed to regain control of his bike, but his face was twisted in anger. "What the hell, old man," he shouted, his voice full of rage. "You think that's funny? You think you can just mess with us?" Ben didn't answer. He didn't need to. His actions had spoken louder than any words could. He had shown them that he wasn't someone to be messed with. He was no longer just the quiet truck driver. He was someone they should fear. The bikers looked at each other, unsure of what to do next. They had thought they could break him, that they could push him around like they had done to so many others. But now they were second-guessing themselves. They weren't sure if they should back down, or if they should try to fight. Either way, they had made a serious mistake, and they were beginning to realize just how much they had underestimated Ben. The next few days were the hardest. The bikers, emboldened by their previous actions, began to escalate their attacks. It was as though they were testing Ben, trying to push him further, to see just how far they could go before he broke. But Ben didn't react. He remained calm, a stone wall in the face of their cruelty. One morning, Ben found his truck with slashed tires. The deep gashes in the rubber seemed to mock him, daring him to do something. He didn't. Instead, he took a deep breath and went to work, changing the tires quietly, without a word. The next day, as he approached his truck, Ben noticed the bright, angry streaks of spray paint across his door. Red, yellow, and black swirls formed ugly words and symbols. It was a mess, but Ben didn't let it rattle him. He had seen much worse. He didn't care about the paint. He cared about what they were trying to do: break him, humiliate him, force him to react. But Ben wasn't one to fall for cheap tricks. He simply got some paint remover and cleaned it off. Again, no words. No anger. But it didn't stop there. The bikers, thinking they were clever, took it a step further. One evening, as Ben prepared to start his truck for another long haul, he noticed something strange. The engine sounded different, sluggish, almost like it wasn't getting the fuel it needed. He popped the hood, and that's when he saw it, the sugar. Sugar had been poured into his gas tank. Ben stared at the mess, the white crystals glistening in the dim light. His first thought was one of mild disbelief. How petty! How stupid! But his second thought was one of resolve. The bikers had crossed a line. They had made a mistake. Ben had no intention of letting this go. Not this time. But he didn't act immediately. He knew that rushing into a situation without thinking was never the right move. His training had taught him patience, something the bikers clearly didn't understand. Over the next few days, Ben continued with his work, moving with the quiet precision of a man who had learned to stay calm under pressure. He paid attention to the bikers, watched them from a distance, studied their routines. The more he observed, the more he saw the weaknesses in their group. It was clear that the bikers operated on a kind of mob mentality. They were a pack, but not a smart one. They relied on intimidation and fear, hoping their numbers and loud bikes would be enough to control the situation. But Ben saw things they didn't see. One evening, As the sun set low and the sky turned a soft shade of purple, Ben saw the bikers gathered by the edge of town, talking amongst themselves, laughing loudly. He kept his distance, not wanting to draw attention, but his eyes never left them. There was Rick, the leader of the group. He was the biggest of them all, tall, muscular, with a thick beard and tattoos covering his arms. He was the one who had led the harassment from the start, the one who had always been the loudest and most confident. But there was something about him that Ben had noticed, something that made him stand out. Rick wasn't as smart as he thought he was. Ben had been watching him, learning his patterns, noticing how he acted around the others. Rick was arrogant, no doubt about that, but he was also careless. Ben could see it in the way he ignored the little things, the small signs that could have alerted him to trouble. He was too focused on being the leader, too busy trying to control everyone else to pay attention to his own actions. Rick made the same mistake over and over. He didn't hide his intentions. He wasn't subtle in the way he approached people. Ben could see through it. It was easy for him to predict Rick's next move, and that gave him an advantage. Then there was the rest of the gang, the followers. Ben had started to pick up on their personalities as well. The small biker, the one who had taunted him the most, was named Tony. Tony was all talk, loud and brash, but there was something fragile about him. He relied too much on the group, too afraid to stand on his own. He followed Rick like a shadow, but Ben could see the cracks in their friendship. Tony was desperate for approval, for validation, and that made him predictable. And then there was the woman in the group. Her name was Julie, and while she didn't speak as much as the others, Ben could see she had a sharp mind. She didn't seem to care much for the drama between the bikers, and there was a distance in her eyes whenever she interacted with Rick or the others. Ben had noticed that Julie often stayed on the sidelines, watching more than she participated. He wondered if she was more than just a follower, but for now, he kept that thought to himself. The more Ben watched them, the more he learned about their weaknesses. They were loud, yes, and they thought they were powerful because of their numbers and their noise. But they didn't know the first thing about real power. They didn't know how to read a situation, how to plan for what came next. They were used to getting by on fear and intimidation, things that Ben had seen before, things that didn't faze him. One day, after another encounter with the bikers where they had taunted him and tried to provoke him again, Ben sat down at his truck and began to think. His mind raced through the details. He had learned enough. He knew their weaknesses now. He had the advantage. And they didn't even know it. Ben had been patient, letting the bikers believe they had control. But he knew it was time to act. He wasn't going to let them destroy his truck, his livelihood, without making them pay for it. He wasn't just going to let them walk all over him. He spent the night planning. Quietly, methodically. He knew it wasn't enough just to defend himself. He had to strike back, but in a way that made sure they would never target him again. He couldn't let them get away with their games. Ben knew that Rick was the key. If he could take Rick out of the equation, the rest of the bikers would scatter. They needed a leader, and without one, they would fall apart. But Rick wasn't going to be easy to take down. Ben had to be careful. He couldn't rush this. One wrong move, and everything could go wrong. Ben knew the time had come to take action. The bikers had crossed too many lines, and he couldn't allow it to continue. For weeks, they had tried to provoke him, humiliate him, and destroy his property, but Ben had always kept his cool. Now, he was done playing their game. It wasn't just about the damage they had caused to his truck or the personal insults they had thrown at him. It was about respect. They had assumed he was weak, an easy target. They had treated him like a nobody, thinking that because he didn't retaliate immediately, he was powerless. But Ben knew better. The true power lay in patience. The ability to wait, to observe, to learn. As he sat in his truck late that night, the air cold and still around him, Ben ran over the details in his mind again. He had spent the past few days observing the bikers' movements, their routines, and their habits. He had learned more than enough. First, there was Rick, the leader. Ben had already noticed Rick's arrogance, but now he understood it better. Rick wasn't just an arrogant man, he was a man who hid his insecurities behind a facade of toughness. He didn't trust his gang. He relied on their fear of him, but deep down, Ben knew that if he could take Rick out of the picture, the group would crumble. Without Rick's presence, the bikers would fall apart, and the rest of them would scatter, unsure of what to do. Ben had a plan. It was simple but effective. He didn't need to fight them directly. He didn't need to make a scene or start a confrontation. No, he would do something that would hit them where it hurt their pride. The bikers loved their bikes, their machines. They prided themselves on their motorcycles, treating them like extensions of themselves. The more Ben thought about it, the clearer it became, Rick's bike was the key. If he could disable it, the entire group would be thrown into disarray. They wouldn't be able to do anything without their leader's bike, and Rick would lose his edge. He would be exposed for the weak, insecure leader he truly was. Ben knew exactly what he needed to do. The next evening, he went into town to gather the necessary tools. He didn't want to make a spectacle of himself, so he kept his movements subtle. He picked up a few things, some basic equipment he could use to disable Rick's bike. Nothing too fancy, but enough to get the job done. As he walked through the small hardware store, Ben couldn't help but notice the people around him. They all seemed to go about their business, unaware of what was brewing in the quiet man's mind. No one knew what he was capable of, and that was exactly how he liked it. He was an enigma. To the people in this town, Ben was just another truck driver. But to the bikers, he was about to become something else entirely. Once he had everything he needed, he returned to his truck and began preparing. He wasn't sure when he would make his move, but he had everything in place. The patience he had learned during his military training was paying off. Ben understood the value of waiting. Rushing would only make him sloppy. The bikers had underestimated him, but that was their mistake. For the next few days, Ben stayed out of sight. He didn't make any unnecessary moves. He knew the bikers were watching him, and he didn't want to give them any reason to suspect that something was different. He went about his daily routine, just as he always had. But in the back of his mind, he was always thinking about what came next. On the third day after gathering his tools, Ben saw his opportunity. It was just after sunset, and the bikers had gathered again in their usual spot. Ben watched them from a distance, hiding in the shadows. He knew Rick would be there, along with the others. They had made this spot their hangout for weeks, and they had grown comfortable there. The gang was relaxed, unaware of Ben's presence. They were laughing, joking, and revving their bikes. Ben could see Rick leaning against his motorcycle, talking to the others. It was the perfect moment. Ben moved quickly, staying low and out of sight. He knew exactly where Rick's bike was parked. The bike was large, powerful, and well-maintained, Rick's pride and joy. It was his most valuable possession, and Ben knew that it would be the perfect target. As he approached the bike, Ben took a deep breath. His hands were steady, his mind focused. The tools he had brought with him were simple, but they would do the job. He started with the tires, deflating them silently. The soft hiss of the air escaping was barely noticeable against the background noise of the bikers. He moved quickly, making sure not to leave any trace of his actions. Once the tires were flat, he moved to the fuel line. With precise movements, he disconnected it, knowing that the bike would be useless without gas. If Rick tried to start it, he would quickly realize that it wasn't going anywhere. Ben took a step back, surveying his work. Everything was in place. Now, all he had to do was wait. From his hidden vantage point, Ben watched as the bikers began to notice the changes. They were too busy talking to notice anything at first, but eventually, Rick tried to start his bike. The engine sputtered and stalled, and Rick's frustration was palpable. "What the hell," he muttered, hitting the throttle again and again, but the bike wouldn't start. The others gathered around him, asking what was wrong. Ben could see the panic creeping into Rick's eyes as he realized something was wrong, something that couldn't be fixed easily. As Rick fumbled with his bike, trying to figure out what had happened, Ben smiled to himself. He had taken the first step. The bikers had no idea that they had just lost their leader's most valuable asset. And now, with Rick struggling to get his bike started, the bikers would be left without direction. Without their leader, they would fall apart. It was only a matter of time before their sense of unity crumbled. Ben knew this wasn't the end of it. He wasn't finished. But the first part of his plan had worked. The bikers would soon realize that messing with him had been a mistake. And when they did, they would wish they had never crossed paths with him. The evening had a stillness that seemed almost unnatural, as though the world was holding its breath. The sky above was painted with the last remnants of a sunset, the orange glow fading into deep blue. It was on this quiet, deserted stretch of highway that Ben knew the bikers would come. For weeks now, they had been harassing him, pushing him to his limits, but tonight was different. Tonight, the game would change. Ben had been waiting for them. While they plotted their attack, he had been preparing his own trap, a plan so precise, so calculated, that even Rick and his gang would never see it coming. It wasn't about violence. It was about sending a message. A message that would make sure they understood one thing: Ben wasn't just any truck driver. No, Ben was someone they would never understand. He had a past, one that was about to rise up and remind them why they shouldn't mess with him. As the bikers approached, their engines roaring louder and louder, Ben's fingers hovered over the trigger of a carefully hidden device. He watched them from a distance, his heart steady, his breathing calm. Rick, leading the pack, looked confident as usual, a grin on his face as he saw Ben's truck in the distance. He was certain tonight would be no different. It was just another night for the bikers to terrorize someone, to make themselves feel powerful. But they were wrong. This wasn't just any night. As Rick's bike neared the point of no return, the carefully placed triggers were activated. In a split second, a series of explosions erupted along the road, their sound deafening in the silence of the night. The force of the blast sent shockwaves through the air, knocking the bikers off balance and sending them tumbling in every direction. Ben had planned everything down to the last detail. The explosions weren't meant to hurt them, just to disorient and force them to stop. The road was blocked, their motorcycles rendered useless by the chaos. They hadn't seen it coming, and now they were trapped. As the dust settled, Ben stepped out from the shadows, his face calm but fierce. He had set this up, and now it was time to face them. Rick's gang, still dazed and confused from the blasts, scrambled to regain their footing. They hadn't expected this. They hadn't prepared for Ben to be the one to turn the tables. Rick, still trying to recover from the shock, looked up and saw Ben standing there. His smirk faltered, and a flicker of realization crossed his eyes. This wasn't the Ben they had been mocking, the quiet man in the truck. No, this was someone else entirely. Someone who had been hiding in plain sight, waiting for the right moment. "I think you've made a mistake, Rick," Ben said, his voice steady, almost calm. He took a few steps forward, his gaze never leaving the bikers. "This is where your fun ends." Rick's hands trembled slightly as he gripped the handle of his bike. He was used to being in control, used to being the one who intimidated others. But now, it was clear that Ben was not someone he could push around. The smugness that had defined Rick for so long was gone, replaced by doubt and confusion. He had no idea who Ben really was. Ben's gaze didn't waver. He knew exactly what was going through Rick's mind, the realization that they had underestimated him. The same mistake they had made time and time again. But this wasn't about showing them how strong he was. This was about something much bigger. You think you've been playing me, don't you? Ben continued, his voice never rising above a controlled tone. You've been messing with the wrong guy. But now, it's my turn. Rick's confusion deepened. What do you mean, your turn? Who the hell are you? He stepped forward, his hand reaching for a weapon, but Ben was quicker. With a swift motion, he pulled out a small device and pressed a button. Another series of explosions went off, blocking any possible escape routes for the bikers. The bikers stood in stunned silence. They were trapped. They had no choice but to face Ben, to confront the man they had underestimated. Ben's eyes were unflinching as he spoke. You see, Rick, I didn't just drive trucks. I didn't just get pushed around. I'm not who you think I am. The words hung in the air, and for a moment Rick and the others could only stare. The quiet man they had ridiculed and attacked for weeks wasn't just a victim. He was something far more dangerous than they could have imagined. Ben took another step forward. I'm a former Army engineer. I was trained in demolitions, in tactical combat. I know how to take things apart, and I know how to make sure things never go back to the way they were. Rick's expression shifted. The realization hit him like a slap in the face. He had made a grave mistake. Ben wasn't just some helpless old man in a truck. He was trained. He was dangerous. And the bikers had just learned that the hard way. As Ben stood there, his presence overwhelming in the silence of the aftermath, the bikers began to understand the full extent of their mistake. They had thought they could bully him. They had thought he was just another person to mess with, to break down for their own amusement. But Ben had been quiet for a reason. He had been observing, waiting for the right moment to strike back. Rick, now fully aware of who he was dealing with, took a step back. His bravado was gone, replaced by fear. Ben wasn't just a truck driver anymore. He wasn't just the target of their cruel games. He was someone who had the power to turn their entire world upside down, and he had done just that. You don't know what you've just done, Rick muttered, his voice strained with frustration. Ben's response was calm, almost too calm. No, Rick. You don't know what you've just done. This is the last time you'll ever mess with me, or anyone else. The bikers looked around, unsure of what to do. They had no leader now. No direction. They were a group of individuals, scattered and unsure. Ben had taken control without ever raising his voice, without ever needing to be violent. The power had shifted. Ben had gone from being the target to being the one in charge. And now, the bikers were the ones who had to deal with the consequences of underestimating him. Rick's gang began to disperse, no longer a unified force, but a group of disoriented individuals who knew they had been bested. Ben didn't need to lift a finger more. His actions had already spoken louder than words ever could. As the last of the bikers retreated into the distance, Ben stood alone in the quiet aftermath. His truck was still standing, undamaged. The bikers had been defeated, and Ben had finally reclaimed the respect he deserved. But even as the dust settled, Ben knew this was only the beginning. The bikers had learned their lesson, but there were always others who would try to take advantage of those they thought were weak. Ben wasn't finished yet. The sound of the explosion still echoed in the air, reverberating through the deserted stretch of highway. As the dust settled, the bikers were left in disarray, their motorcycles damaged and abandoned in the chaos. The once confident, arrogant gang was now scattered, their sense of control completely shattered. Ben stood tall, his face calm but with a sense of purpose that seemed to glow in the dimming light. He didn't show any signs of relief or satisfaction. He simply watched the scene unfold in front of him, as the bikers struggled to regain their bearings. It wasn't about pride for Ben. It was about sending a message, one that needed to be heard, loud and clear. The town had always looked at Ben with disdain. He was just a lonely truck driver, a man who seemed to blend into the background, unnoticed and forgotten. People drove by him every day, assuming there was nothing remarkable about him. They thought he was just like everyone else, just a cog in the machine. But the truth was far different. Beneath his quiet exterior, Ben had the skills, the training, and the experience to take on far more than anyone could imagine. The bikers had found that out the hard way, and now the whole town would know the truth about him. Ben turned and saw the flashing lights of the local police cars approaching. He had called them before the explosions went off, making sure they would be nearby when everything went down. They had been tipped off about the bikers' activities, their constant harassment of Ben and other townspeople. Now, it was time for the law to take over. The officers arrived quickly, getting out of their cars and moving cautiously toward the wreckage. Their eyes shifted from the wrecked motorcycles to Ben, standing in the middle of the chaos like a figure of calm amidst the storm. They had heard rumors about the bikers, how they had been causing trouble, breaking the law, and terrorizing the people in the town. But no one had expected it to end like this. One of the officers, a seasoned veteran named Sergeant Martin, approached Ben. His eyes narrowed as he sized up the situation. He had seen violence before, but something about this was different. Ben wasn't the kind of man who looked like he could cause trouble. And yet, here he was, in control of everything. He had turned the tables on the bikers, and now they were the ones being arrested. "Everything okay, Mr. Harris?" Sergeant Martin asked, his voice laced with a mix of curiosity and respect. Ben nodded, his expression still steady. "Everything's fine now, Sergeant. They're the ones who started it." The officers began cuffing the bikers, who were now stumbling around, too disoriented and afraid to put up a fight. They had thought they could walk all over Ben, but now they were paying the price. They hadn't realized they were messing with someone far more capable than they could ever imagine. Rick, the leader of the gang, was one of the last to be handcuffed. His once confident attitude had been replaced by a look of defeat. He glared at Ben, his eyes filled with a mix of hatred and awe. He had no words for the man who had turned his world upside down. Rick had underestimated him. He had thought Ben was just a lonely truck driver, easy to push around, but now he realized the mistake he had made. Ben glanced at him but didn't say a word. The bikers had had their chance. They had crossed a line that shouldn't have been crossed, and now they had to deal with the consequences. The town, which had once overlooked Ben, was now watching as he stood there, unshaken and resolute. The officers finished making the arrests, and soon the bikers were being loaded into the police cars, their faces a mix of anger and confusion. They hadn't expected their own actions to lead to their downfall. As they were driven away, Ben remained standing by the side of the road, watching them go. He had done what needed to be done, and now the law would handle the rest. Word of the bikers' arrest spread quickly through the town. People who had once ignored Ben began to take notice. They had seen him as just a quiet man, someone who kept to himself and minded his own business. They hadn't realized the depth of his strength or the strength of his character. But now, they could see it. Ben had taken a stand, and he had done it with quiet determination. He hadn't needed to prove anything to anyone, but now the truth was out. He wasn't just a truck driver. He was someone with the power to protect the town and himself. As the news of the bikers' arrest continued to spread, more and more people started to come forward with stories of their own encounters with the gang. The bikers had terrorized the town for far too long, and now they were finally facing justice. It was a moment of relief for everyone who had been living in fear, knowing that the menace that had cast a shadow over their lives was finally gone. The local news outlets picked up the story, and soon Ben found himself in the spotlight. He hadn't asked for it, but the reporters were eager to know who the man behind the explosions was. They wanted to know the story behind the quiet truck driver who had taken down a gang of dangerous bikers. At first, Ben didn't say much. He wasn't interested in the fame or the attention. But as more people started to approach him, he realized something: he had earned their respect. It wasn't just about the bikers anymore. It was about how the people of the town saw him now, as a protector, as a man who had stood up when no one else had the courage to do so. One afternoon, as Ben sat in a small diner, he overheard a conversation between a couple of local men. They were talking about the events of the past few days, the way the bikers had terrorized the town, and how Ben had been the one to stop them. "I never thought Ben had it in him," one of the men said. "He's always just been that quiet truck driver. Never made a fuss about anything. But when those bikers came after him, he sure showed them who's boss." The other man nodded in agreement. "Yeah, I always thought he was just some old guy in a truck, you know. But now I think we all owe him a lot more respect." Ben listened quietly, his eyes focused on his coffee cup. The conversation wasn't about him anymore. It wasn't about proving anything. It was about the change he had brought to the town, the shift in how people saw him and others like him. He hadn't been the loudest or the flashiest person in the room. He hadn't been the one to seek attention. But now, the town knew who he was. They knew what he was capable of, and they respected him for it. As the days went by, the bikers were dealt with in the courts. The charges against them were serious vandalism, harassment, and even terrorizing the town. They were sentenced to serve time for their crimes, and the town could finally breathe a little easier, knowing that they were no longer under threat. Ben, however, returned to his quiet life. He didn't need praise or recognition. He had done what he needed to do, and that was enough for him. He kept driving his truck, doing what he did best. But now, every time he passed through the town, people greeted him with respect. They didn't look at him the same way anymore. They knew that the quiet man with the old truck was far more than he seemed. And for Ben, that was all the reward he needed. He had stood up for what was right, and in the end, that was all that mattered. As time went on, life in the town slowly returned to normal. The bikers, now locked away behind bars, were nothing more than a distant memory. The town's streets grew quieter, and the people who had once feared the sound of motorcycle engines roaring down the road could now sleep a little easier at night. For the first time in a long time, the air felt lighter, free from the constant threat that had hung over them for so many months. But for Ben Harris, life had also returned to its quiet rhythm. He still drove his truck, still made his deliveries, and still kept to himself. The world outside had moved on, but Ben knew that the impact of what had happened would last far longer than the bikers' reign of terror. He wasn't one to seek attention, and he wasn't one to ask for recognition. That's not why he had done what he did. He hadn't acted out of revenge or a desire for fame. He had acted because he knew it was the right thing to do. The people who had underestimated him, who had looked down on him, had seen only a man with a truck and a quiet demeanor. They hadn't seen the skills, the experience, the training, or the strength that lay beneath the surface. Sometimes, the quietest people in the room carry the heaviest burdens. They don't boast about their skills or announce their power. They keep it hidden, not because they are afraid to share it, but because they understand that true strength is never loud or showy. It is steady. It is patient. It waits for the moment when it is truly needed. And when that moment comes, those who are ready will act. Ben had waited for that moment. He had watched the bikers for weeks, studied their routines, observed their weaknesses. He had known exactly what needed to be done, and he had done it with a calm precision that left everyone around him stunned. No one had expected it. No one had seen it coming. And yet, in the end, it was Ben who had brought them down. It was his quiet strength, his inner resolve, that had made the difference. For those who had taunted him, who had believed he was just a simple truck driver with nothing special to offer, the truth had come as a shock. They had looked at him and seen only what was on the outside, an older man, quiet, unassuming, blending in with the world around him. But they had missed what really mattered. They had missed the fact that Ben wasn't just any man. He was a man who had lived through challenges, who had faced danger and uncertainty, and who had come out stronger because of it. The quietest people, the ones who go unnoticed, often carry the heaviest burdens. But those burdens are what make them strong. They learn to endure. They learn to persevere. And when the time comes, they rise. Ben hadn't been looking for a fight. He hadn't wanted to be in the spotlight. He had simply wanted to live his life in peace. But the bikers had forced his hand. They had thought they could push him around. They had thought he was just another easy target. But what they hadn't known was that Ben had already faced battles much harder than anything they could throw at him. He had faced the darkness of war, the uncertainty of loss, and the weight of responsibilities that many could never understand. He had been through more than they could imagine. And in the end, that was what made him different. He was ready when the time came. He didn't need to prove anything to anyone. He didn't need to show off or make a spectacle of his abilities. He simply did what needed to be done. And that, perhaps, is the true measure of strength. Ben didn't care for recognition. He didn't care for fame. All he wanted was to do what was right and protect the people he cared about. And in the end, that was enough. His actions spoke for themselves. The bikers were gone, and the town was safe once again. The people who had once looked down on him now understood. They saw him for who he truly was, a man with integrity, a man with a purpose, and a man who would never back down when it came to doing what was right. It's easy to overlook the quiet ones. The ones who don't shout their achievements or demand attention. But those are often the ones who carry the greatest strength. They are the ones who are ready when the world needs them the most. They don't seek validation or praise. They don't need others to recognize their worth. Their actions speak louder than words ever could. And that's a lesson we should all remember. So, when you look at the world around you, when you judge the people you meet, remember this: the ones who seem the least remarkable may be the ones who hold the greatest potential. The ones who speak the least may have the most to say when the time comes. And those who seem the weakest may be the ones who have the strength to overcome anything. Because in the end, the quietest people in the room often carry the heaviest burdens. They are the ones who face the struggles, the battles, and the hardships. And when the time comes to stand up, they are the ones who rise to the occasion. Ben Harris had risen. And in doing so, he had shown everyone the true power of quiet strength. The town would never forget what he had done. But more importantly, they would never forget who he was. They would remember him not as the lonely truck driver, but as the man who had stood up for what was right no matter the cost. And for Ben, that was enough. That was all he had ever wanted. Because sometimes, the greatest strength comes not from the loudest actions, but from the quietest resolve. And when the time comes to act, it is those who have carried their burdens quietly, patiently, who are the ones who change everything.